As part of Mental Health Week in 2020, the Fellowship of Australian Writers Queensland sat down with people from different backgrounds to discuss how the creative art of writing helped build resilience in their life. Dr. Indrani Ganguly, writer, adventurer and traveller, and the author of the historical novel The Rose and the Thorn, has had a long journey with the writing process. Indrani begins by explaining how that journey began.
Basically, it was because I liked writing. I enjoyed writing, being able to express my thoughts. And I enjoyed my English language and English literature classes. So part of the exercises we were set were to write essays, short stories, poems, and that was one of the things I genuinely enjoyed writing. What really got me onto more serious writing was my best friend coming up to my dad and saying, "Oh, Indrani just has to pick up her pen and the stories just flow out." And my dad, who always believed that girls can do anything, said, "Oh, well, this might be something you take up in future." So he bought me a little typewriter, a little manual typewriter, and enrolled me in a writing course, and that's how it all started.
So your father was one of the important influences on your life at that stage?
Yes, that's why I have a book dedicated to him. As I said, he was always ready to encourage me to do things outside the conventional school curriculum. So whether it was doing judo as an extracurricular activity, much to the horror of my mother, who thought it was a very unladylike thing to do. And he was quite happy to go and argue with the Mother Superior that making us do needlework was a waste of time. We'd be better off doing maths. I wasn't very good at maths. So yes, and also my father was a great believer in the whole mind, body, spirit. So the mind was, of course, the intellectual and cultural activities. Body was sport. He taught me to swim, which wasn't very common with middle-class women at the time I was growing up. And also to play badminton and a host of other sports. If my friends weren't around, he would play. He always said you need to have both. And the spirit was kind of accepting that it's not enough to have skills or talents. You have to be patient, perseverant, and use those skills and talents to connect with other people in a positive way. So all of these.
In your writing, you describe how you were able to create your own space as well as form connections through that. And you had a very difficult relationship with your mother as well. Can we just talk about how writing your poetry was able to help you create that space?
Yes, I should say my mother had a difficult relationship with practically everyone in the family. But I've never written about my mother, because that can do damage. I don't believe in... I think you can pull out certain characteristics to recreate your own characters, and they can be both positive and negative. And she did have positive character. But the writing provided a legitimate way of withdrawing. I should explain that with Bengalis, the creative arts, literature, cinema, theatre are held in very high regard. So if you withdrew to write something, that was fine. I also got a tip from my maternal grandmother, who had a very difficult relationship with her mother-in-law, and in those days mothers-in-law had a lot of power over the daughters-in-law. So her way of escape was to withdraw into her prayer room, where she could close the door and she could spend quite a bit of time doing holy things. But it was a dialogue with the mother goddess, whose festival is the biggest festival in the Hindu pantheon, and the mother goddess descends to earth with her family, and Hindus tend to humanize their gods. So that story actually inspired a poem called A Woman's Solitude, and I'll just read you a few lines.
Please.
Perhaps not the full poem.
Please.
It's called A Woman's Solitude. There is no joy greater than that of solitude. In my prayer room, I can invoke my solitude. I can touch my solitude. I can wrap myself in it. The great Mother Goddess smiles at me, accepting without question my offerings of sweets and flowers. The prayers I chant still the tremors in my mind. Then I step out, and your grandfather says, "Cook didn't do the fish well today. Ramlal's burnt a hole in my shirt, and Mina's failed her math test again." I deal with them all, knowing that in a few hours I can dialogue with my solitude again. The Mother Goddess's smile glitters like the spear that she holds at the throat of the demon king groveling at her feet. I pray to her and think of the dangerous questions I will ask tomorrow.
It's wonderful, that sense of dialogue with solitude. Do you want to explain how in your writing you were able to dialogue with solitude and what that meant for you?
As I said, it created a space, it created a time. I was an only child, so I was used to creating my own resources. I didn't always need to have somebody around, but I also needed to have a creative outlet. It's not just sitting in my room and staring at the wall. And I read a poem by Byron where he says that unless he empties his mind periodically, he would go mad. So the solitude was the opportunity to empty my mind and put things down on paper.
And you actually refer to that on your blog site, don't you?
That's
in terms
right.
of your writing. So just tell us a little more about your writing on your blog. You write about some of your journeys and some of your adventures?
Yes, the Writer Traveler Adventurer was a kind of subtitle thought up by some of my writer friends. They wanted me to put adventurer first because according to them I've done a lot of different things. And the writing helped put me to express my thoughts. It helped me to share thoughts. It also helps to refine your thoughts because, when you're talking, you do it extempo. It can go from here, there, everywhere. With writing, you have to be, unless you're doing stream of consciousness, which I don't like much because I get lost. But it does help you to focus.
Yes. And
here I could refer to another quote that's from Anne Frank, who, as you know, was hiding from the Nazis until she and her family were discovered. And she said that writing, the ability to create something, filled her with courage, the courage to go on. And
so that was a connection with herself, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. And that really resonated with me.
So your writing is also academic writing as well, in terms of your PhD thesis and those. Can you just explain the difference to you of writing for yourself and writing for an academic purpose?
Well, writing for myself, it's basically as if someone who reads all my stuff said, you're writing from the heart. You don't have to follow many protocols or what other people want you to write, unless, of course, you're doing it for a living, in which, to me, I keep it as a hobby. Mm-hmm. Following the advice of an uncle who was a big Bollywood star, and he said, Indrani, never make your passion your profession because you will lose the passion.
You lose the passion.
And so that was it. The academic writing, I actually liked the intellectual challenge it presented, and they kind of meshed together because the research that I did for the academic writing has also inspired much of the creative writing, starting with small stories. When I was doing the research for my thesis, I picked up a lot of anecdotal stories about what was happening during that period, and they then started to form the base.
So your thesis was about the British occupation in West Bengal, but you've written a novel recently called The Rose and the Thorn, which you used a lot of that information to write in that historical novel. Do you want to talk about The Rose and the Thorn?
That's right, and that really stemmed from, first of all, I spent... this is a town called Burdwan in Bengal, and my professor at the ANU said, look, Indrani, everyone's written about the big cities. You have the perfect opportunity to write about the smaller places that no one knows much about. and why don't you go and do your research there? So I said fine, and I used to always think of it as this rather boring regional centre that was forced to spend summer holidays, but doing the research gave me a whole new perspective. And in the evenings I would sit with my grandparents, and my grandmother told me of all the little things that she as a so-called ordinary woman did. One was, of course, trying to learn how to spin, which was part of the national movement. The other one was also setting up a self-employment center for widows of middle-class people who did not have the avenues for earning their living. Like, they couldn't really go and work in a factory or in the fields, so this was a self-help. And that story, and the other bit was my grandfather, who knew practically everyone in the city and all the goings-on under the surface, told me these stories of all the unconventional relationships that happened, and the two together kind of, it took a long time for that to gel into a story. It didn't actually happen until I came to Australia about 20 years later, and I wrote a short story, invented a bit, and had twins representing the rose and the thorn. And my writer friends, the Society of Women Writers, said, "Oh, Indrani, this has great potential for a short novel. So why don't you turn it into a novel?" And that's how it started.
So the twins, the protagonists are the rose and the thorn. Do you want to just talk about for a moment the sense in which both the rose and the thorn was incorporated in both characters, rather than each individual?
Yes, I mean, I don't believe that characters are black and white. We all have a good side and we all have a dark side. I also want to talk about the symbiotic relationship between the rose and the thorn. The rose needs the thorn to survive, but the thorn has no purpose unless it has the rose to defend. And I did leave it to the reader to decide if they could categorize the characters into either the rose and the thorn, and most people came back and said they couldn't.
So it's that acceptance of both sides, the light and dark. It's what some people would call the diversity, the acceptance of diversity, that is a strength in your writing.
Yes.
Yes. So do you want to just explain just how much that came from your own observations as you grew up in the diverse nature of Indian society?
Yes, well, starting with the setting. The one setting is Lucknow. And I'll just hold up the book and explain the symbology. And when I asked the publisher to design a cover, of course, they came up with the Taj Mahal. And I said, the Taj Mahal has no relevance to this story. I've got a photograph of this. It's called the Bara Imam Bara. It was built during a time of famine by the ruler. What he did was, he didn't want to give a handout, he wanted to give a hand up. And he got all the poor people to come and dig the foundations and whatever and start building it. And in the evening, the rich people would come and tear it down. So the next morning, they would have to start again. And so they got the wages for many. And then it was finished. But inside this Imam Bara, there's an amazing maze where the trick is that to go up, you actually go down. And to go down, you actually take the staircase that leads you up. And I thought that was a great metaphor for the kind of journey that the characters had here. Two girls growing up in a moderately conservative family, moving towards a more liberal outlook, and the tensions between following what society tells them, finish your studies, get married, have children, but also then wanting to be part of the bigger picture, the national movement and social reform.
So it was that sense of the difference that you expressed through the two characters.
Yes, and they're from a Hindu family, the Bengali Hindu, but one of them does have a relationship with a Muslim, and that's very true to Lucknow because it was the seat of a very enlightened and cultural Muslim family, and for many years the relationships between them was very cordial. They might not have married, but certainly lots of strong friendships. The other town is a more conservative one. That's a smaller one where people are more constricted in their their views, and that's where I put the scene. As I use that as the setting for the self-help. Swavlambi means self-dependent or independent.
Do you want to just explain that a little bit in terms of the way you did it in the novel?
So I put the setting there because I thought, well, the sister who goes there wants an outlet. She doesn't have the opportunity right away to join in the national movement, but she could join in the reforms that were happening parallel to the national movement. And that's where, because even for middle class women to go out and earn a living was quite revolutionary in those days.
So this was a time of considerable upheaval in India.
In both ways.
And a time of great change. People were confronted by difficult decisions and difficult choices in life.
Yes, and although it was a relatively non-violent movement, there was still violence.
The conflict, though, was more internal as well, and that's what you express in the novel, I think, in terms of the way in which people had to make decisions based on the path they wanted to follow.
Yes, well, should they opt for a safe, comfortable middle-class life, because most of the people there are middle, or should they start taking risks in terms of the long-term future? And what is the kind of country they want to bequeath to their own children?
And to an extent, we face those sorts of questions today with the sorts of challenges we have with the situation that we're in with the health situation. Do you want to just explain how that perhaps you see that at the moment?
I think it's being confronted by a lack of certainty. We've become very comfortable, and particularly in Australia, which has a lot of safeguards, is protected by the sea, so it doesn't have the challenges of land borders that many other. But from that comes creativity. People are adapting. We are probably never going to go back to the life we had before. Some of us are in a better situation to deal with that than others, and I think we always have to be mindful because we could be in that situation as well.
So in your current writing, that sort of challenge that you see, your response is a creative one. Do you want to just talk about how your writing is a way in which you can come to terms with that challenge?
As I said, it's a way of me getting my thoughts together, and writing in Australia is of course a different kind of challenge because I'm from a minority background in a predominantly white Anglo-Saxon, and I don't want to be pigeonholed into my community, so learning to bridge the barriers. And that's a constant learning process, which is why I started writing the cross-cultural capers, because it makes me think through all the connections.
Do you want to just explain the cross-cultural capers just for a moment?
Well, the capers was a bit of a, I just wanted it to be a bit humorous as well, and cross-cultural is about the many different dimensions of it, whether it's Aboriginal or white Anglo-Saxon or the many, Australia is an amazing melting pot of many different, and yet all the groups retain their own individuality and their own culture without there being any massive upheavals, perhaps with the exception of the situation of the Aboriginal people.
So it's your observations and your thoughts and your reflections on the diversity that is Australian culture.
Yeah, and that's why I wrote the first piece was about the use of the English language. What meant one thing in India quite often means something quite different here.
So it's that journey through the language that becomes the creative aspect of your writing.
And that's right. And going back to your question about the academic writing, yes, I continue to explore some of the themes through the academic writing as well. I was invited to come and speak at a conference on culture and citizenship, and I said I don't want to just talk about my own journey because that could be a bit boring. Why don't I sound out some other women who are from similar middle class professional backgrounds, who are migrants, and what has been their journey in acquiring an Australian identity? What were the elements that helped them feel part of the wider Australian society? And we looked at a number of things, like who did they actually think of when they heard the word Australian? And everyone said Anglo-Australian, not one person said Aboriginal. And I think that's the way we're taught to think. But then what helped them build up their own identity? Was it their language, their culture, their religion, the food? And again, there was quite a lot of unanimity. Everyone said it was the work they did, because the work made them feel they were contributing something to the society, and it helped them make friends from many different backgrounds, including white Anglo, and become part of the fabric that's Australian society. So it's kind of the academic and the creative, kind of, sometimes I can't separate them, except in the way I write it.
And I think they are very much linked. I mean, what you were just talking about in terms of the work, the employment that people have is part of their life, is part of their contribution to society. And that's as much creativity as any of what they call the creative arts, do you think?
Yes, because you do have to feel that you're a useful member of society. You do have to feel valued by society as well in whatever you choose or are able to do.
It's the connection of those three things that you were talking about earlier, the mind, body, spirit, that you said your father was very strong on.
Yes, well, that's why, look, at the age of 94, and he followed that regardless of whatever trials and tribulations. I think he lived to be 94, was completely in possession of all his faculties. He's reading the newspaper.
Indrani, there's a poem that you wrote in that book that I'd like you to read for us, if you don't mind. It's a poem that you wrote as part of a group called United by Pen. Do you just want to explain how that came about?
Yes, that was kind of unconsciously inspired by my maternal grandfather, and we were having my family, particularly his generation, were fairly conservative Hindus, and he was quite religious in his own way, and he said, I'd never see you go and sit in the prayer room with your grandmother, but I think you only go there to get the sweet offerings. And I said, yes, and you studied a Catholic school, but I've never heard you say anything much about. I said, no, I'm not particularly interested in being religious. I'm happy to respect it, but I don't want to follow anyone. And he said, well, it doesn't matter if you don't follow any religion as such, but you must have some belief that helps you to visualize the connections, a kind of spirituality, and so that was it. And I should say that my first book is actually dedicated to my maternal grandfather, because he kind of appointed himself as my research assistant and took me around. The second book is dedicated to my father, and The Rose and the Thorn to my maternal grandmother.
Important people in your life, in the journey of your life. Can you share with us that poem that you wrote for United by Pen? It was set to music, was it not?
It was. We teamed up. We were a group of poets and writers who teamed up with members of a music group which wanted to play the music they wanted to play. And we were asked to perform on Harmony Day. So they said, oh, can you write the lead poem for this? So I remembered what my grandfather had said about connecting on the spiritual level. And that's how it came
Would you like
about.
to read it for us, please, Indrani?
Yes. It's called Spirit Song. I am the world's spirit, unbound by space or time. I've befriended men and women in every land and clime. I come in many forms and have many tales to tell. I'll laugh with you in heaven. I'll cry with you in hell. I am the songs in your heart, the poems in your mind. I am the world spirit, unbound by space or time.
Dr. Indrani Ganguly, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. I always find these dialogues very energizing.